Well, as you can see, we are going to be, I'll bury the lead. I'm a one-trick pony. I have a slide, and that's pretty much my creative juices for the week. But we are going to be talking about time this morning. And one of the things that kind of happens is the last time I shared with you from Ecclesiastes, we were on the farm, and it was probably 10 to 20 degrees warmer and less rain, and a lot more bugs. But that was the last that we were in Ecclesiastes. So I'm going to jump back a little bit. But as we talk about time, I want to share a moment from one of my favorite TV shows with you. Young adults and the folks who hear me talk too much, or they roll their eyes every time I start talking about it. But The American Office. The Office is one of my favorite TV shows. Yes. But in this show, if you haven't seen it, it is a mock documentary. So it is shot like a documentary, but it's all fake. Everything in it's fake. It's all fake characters. But it is shot to make you believe that it is real. And the things that happen are the things that happen at this paper company in Pennsylvania. And it follows the lives of the people who work in this little sales office. And what's baffling is that nothing really ever actually happens in the show, like nothing noteworthy. They create their own drama, I guess. But it's not the most exciting production. Well, what's baffling is that it kind of draws you in as you get to know these characters. And what starts as a show about work, it starts out as this is a story about working. It turns into a story and a show about family. As you fall in love with these characters and the way that these characters interact with one another, you almost find that you are in the room with them. And towards the end of the show, one of the things they do frequently is they will have some sort of chaos going on in the background, and then they will cut to this fake interview with a separate character who talks about what's happening in the background, and it lays this like layer of comedy over top of it. But towards the end of the show, they do that, but they take the funny out of it a little bit, and they start pulling on their heartstrings as they interview characters about what their experience was like working in this office. Again, it's all fake. It's just characters. And one of my favorite lines in the whole show is from a character named Andy. And he says when he's asked, well, what was it like working here? And he says, I wish there was a way that you knew you left the good old days before you left them. The good old days. And the truth is, each one of us, when we hear the idea of the good old days, we think of something different. We can pinpoint maybe a time or a couple times in our lives, and we look back and say, those were the good old days. That's how it used to be. And for others, you might think about it and you might say, well, I think I'm in the good old days now. Count your blessings. The reality is, and the reality that Ecclesiastes and the teacher intends to explore as he continues, and remember, Ecclesiastes is often not a feel-good book. It's got hard truth to tell. The reality that he is going to explore is that the good old days on this earth will end. They do not last forever. And so we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 this morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It's right after Proverbs. And so if you flip to the middle, you're in Psalms. Go 2 books over and you're there. It's sometimes a trick to find it. And as you turn there, I want to briefly remind you of what the teacher's goal is in Ecclesiastes and where we are so far. So the first thing we need to remember is that the teacher is doing a thought experiment of life under the sun. What is this life about? If we try to create meaning just out of our experience on this earth, what is life under the sun? That is the thought experiment he's conducting. And the second thing we need to remember is the teacher's idea of hevel. Hevel is this Hebrew term that often is translated meaningless or vanity or vapor, and it's the idea that when we try to create meaning out of just the things in this life, we are met with this feeling that it's fleeting and it's hard to grasp meaning and it's hard to connect to purpose. It's like a vapor. You can grab at it all you want and you'll never quite catch hold. Third, so far, he has concluded that if this life under the sun is all that there is, the whole thing is kind of meaningless. Like if this is all there is, the whole thing's kind of hevel. That's what he's arrived at. He says that pleasure is hevel, wisdom is hevel, and our work is hevel. That's what he's landed on. It's not a feel-good book. And if you hear that and you go, I did not sign up for this downer, you have arrived at the emotional feeling of the book of Ecclesiastes. In chapter 2, the teacher reminds us, as if we needed it, that we will all die. And by the end of chapter 2, concludes that if we are going to have any sort of meaning and purpose or enjoyment, the best shake that we can give it is that we should eat and drink and enjoy our work. And with all this in mind, he takes that, and the teacher now moves that thought experiment into chapter 3. Life under the sun, trying to create meaning out of this life. And this is what he says. Ecclesiastes 3, starting in verse 1. He says, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up what was planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to tear, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace." Let's pray together. Dear Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the book of Ecclesiastes, and I just thank you for this idea of time. And I just pray that as we explore what the teacher has to say and conclude about time this morning, I pray that we would learn more about you, that we would learn something about ourselves, and that in response to all this, that we would grow in our praise and wonder of you, God. We love you and thank you. In your name we pray. Amen. When I began in Ecclesiastes months back, right out of the gate, I preached one sermon on Ecclesiastes, and Michael Wall walked up to me, and he pulled me aside, and he said, "Hey, there's this spot in Ecclesiastes, and there's this really famous song, and you need to make sure that you talk about it." And often what I do when Michael Wall comes up to me and does these things, I go, "Okay, Michael," and then that's kind of it, and I log it away in my brain. And when I preached on Ecclesiastes 2, he said, "Hey, Ecclesiastes 3 is where that song comes in, so you need to make sure that have you heard it?" And I will confess to you, I did not listen to the song until last week. So it was made in the 60s, question mark? I don't know. But it is a song by the Byrds called "Turn, Turn, Turn." And pretty much this song is an exact copy and paste of Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, with the exception of one line. And they took out that line they took out the bit about war, likely to make their song an anti-war commentary song. So, if you've ever heard "Turn, Turn, Turn," like I now have, you might have had that running through your head as I'm reading that this morning. But unlike the Byrds, who they take war out, Ecclesiastes and the teacher and God's word, they're going to look at some very, very hard truths with these time for everything. The teacher is reflecting on this life under the sun and comes to the conclusion that there is a time for everything. And he reflects in this short poem, and he begins with these contrasts. And we see it, each one, it's not hard to follow. It's a good thing and this bad thing. And he kind of weaves in and out that we are going to go through these seasons in our lives. And in life under the sun, he says, we are born, and one day we will die. And it's a tough, he hits us with the tough one right out of the gate. My son remembers my grandfather primarily as sneaking into his fridge in his assisted living room to sneak grapes out of his fridge as a snack. I think that's my son's primary memory of my grandfather. I'd go out on a limb and say that my daughter does not remember them at all. Too young. Both of my children were born after my grandmothers had passed. And as the teacher explores time, and this time for being born, and eternity, and life on this earth, the emotional weight is, sometimes, time is very frustrating. We want the times to be born to line up better with the times that people die. It's frustrating. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. I'm not a gardener. Every year, Anna ventures into gardening, and I say, you got it. I will cheer you on and put dirt in the thing. And this year, my contribution to our garden was I murdered her zucchini plant with a lawnmower. So I'm not much help. But people who garden know that there is a correct time to plant the stuff, and there is a correct time to harvest the things that you plant. I know it has something to do with frost, but beyond that, I can't really tell you. And there is a specific season, and there are certain things in our lives that are time sensitive. We have to do them at a certain time. And if we miss it, the results and the yield will be much less. Next, he says there is a time to kill and a time to heal. And if you hear that and you go, I really like one of those more than the other. I like the healing thing. It seems pretty good. And I kind of want nothing to do with the killing part. And so I kind of struggled with this because on surface value, it's kind of like, well, I don't really feel like I ever need to be doing much killing. But stories help. And so when I grew up, I had one pet. My mom and dad will tell you that I had a fish. I'm not convinced, and the video evidence does not do me any good. To me, it's a ping pong ball, but whatever. But I had a dog, a golden retriever, golden lab mix named Belle. And she was kind of like my pet. And when my dog was young, we were leaving a lake. And as we pulled away, she jumped out of the truck and got hit by the truck and mangled her leg. And so she's in the back seat with me with this leg, and I'm scared and freaking out. And we get to the vet, and she's young, and they're able to heal her. They're able to help her and fix her. And then she had a little, gimp the rest of her life. It's ironic, because now so do I. But then one day, years and years later, my dog got sick. Her life got poorer and poorer, and we did what so many families have had to do. There was a time to heal, and there's a time where healing does not do any good anymore. There's a time to build and a time to break things down. In this life, under the sun, buildings don't last. They will come down eventually. Even if you think of the giant, amazing structures that humans have built in the past that seem to have stood centuries now, if given enough time and no maintenance, they will fall. When I was growing up, my grandfather worked for the Anaconda Company in Montana. And there was this giant smelter smokestack, but they refined oil, and this was one of the smokestacks from it. And I remember they put it on the news that they were going to blow this thing up and crumble it because it wasn't safe anymore. And they did just that. They blew it up, and it fell a little bit, and then it just stood there. And it didn't fall. And I remember like a lot of the old timers were kind of like, hey, gotcha. Couldn't take it down. But all buildings, if given enough time, will fall. And there's a time that we can build really good structures, and it seems to take forever, like whatever's going on in Fred Meyer parking lot. There's always work being done, and nothing seems to change. But there's a time where buildings fall apart, and they break. The things we do not last forever. He says there is a time for laughing and a time for crying. And we love the laughing times, especially when we have folks to laugh with. I am more prone towards humor. It's how I deal with awkward and weird situations. Often that gets me in trouble. But I love laughter. But there is a time when jokes need to stop. There's a time to put the jokes away, and we need to weep. And in fact, as much as I love to laugh, I think weeping is often more important. I think it has much more value. In the story of Job, it's a story of a guy who had it all and lost everything. His best friends show up on the scene to comfort him, and the best thing that they do is be quiet and weep with him. Pretty much as soon as they start talking, it gets a lot less encouraging. The best thing they do is be quiet and weep with him. There's a time for weeping. There's a time to grieve in this life, and I think if we spent as much time figuring out how to make people laugh as we did figuring out how to grieve well, we would be much more connected. We'd be a lot healthier, and we would be able to deal with things a lot more in our life. The teacher goes on to remind us again that there's a time for mourning and a time for dancing. And this is a reminder that both of those times will end. You might be in the season, in the time of mourning right now, and it doesn't feel good. But the good news is that one day will be a time for dancing. And vice versa. You might be at the top of the world, the dancing days. But bear in mind, those days also end. Life under the sun brings both. He says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. My kids both have a rock collection. I lucked out and now have 2 rock collections in our house. And when it first started, they were bringing every rock that seemed to exist outside of our house into our house and put them in a box. And it was kind of, we have got to tailor this. So then my son got a rock tumbler. And then for a month, we had that rattle in our garage as he tumbles rocks. And now they're really cool looking and they go in the collection. And we might read, well, there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, and think, well, does the teacher have a really cool rock collection that he wants to share with us? As he pulls his box out. No. But no. Maybe, but probably not. Really what this is in the Old Testament, it's a practice of when going out to battle, you would take a bunch of rocks with you. And you would take these rocks, some for weaponry, to throw and to sling at people, like David with Goliath. But other times, you would use these rocks as you go through enemy territory to raise their farmland and stop up their springs and their wells. So that way, once you leave, if there are survivors, they struggle in the land. We see the people do this in 2 Kings 3 and 2 Chronicles 26. And though we are not likely going out to battle into a foreign land with a big pile of rocks in our bag, the idea is sometimes we need to spread stones on things in our lives. We need to utterly do away with them and put them behind us and move on to the better things. There is a time to say no. And then there is a time to clean up those parts that have been damaged and say it is a time to start building something new here. Because while you can sling rocks and stop up springs with rocks, you can also build gates and monuments and buildings with them. There's a time to cast stones away and a time to gather them together. Sometimes it's hard to start a new thing. It's difficult. And it takes some time of bringing those and clearing those stones away and gathering them together to be able to do so. He says there's a time for embracing and a time to stop embracing. If you are a hugger, there's a time, I promise, where you should refrain from doing so. And if you are like me and you are not a hugger, there's times where you need discernment that a hug is needed here. This person needs a hug. It can be tough in times of embracing to let go. And the teacher reminds us, in life under the sun, we often have to do so. We often have to stop embracing. There's a time to seek for something when it's lost and a time to acknowledge it's gone. I hate losing stuff. If I lose stuff, my brain has priority number one. I am fixated on finding it. Drop everything else. And there is a point at which you either find it, which is great, or you have to just say, it is done, I have lost it, I will maybe find it one day, and if not, I'll have to replace it. There's a time to seek for the lost thing and a time to say, it's just gone. There's a time to keep and a time to let things go. We are really good at keeping and saving and storing and having extra. And often we need practice with letting things go. Opening that up and saying, I don't need this. I'm going to let this go. It says there's a time to sow. Interestingly enough, fun fact, I took probably more sewing classes in my time in school than I did any of the other electives, maybe computer stuff. But I'm a big fan of sewing. Here we are. For many people in the Old Testament and impoverished people, the act of altering clothes is necessary. As kids get older, you have to alter clothes so it fits the next kid, and the next one, and the next one. And kids are tough on clothes. They're incredibly tough on clothes. I feel like you buy them a new thing and it's ripped or stained immediately. But sometimes when a garment is damaged, you can't get a new one. If it's your cloak and that's all you have, you got to repair it. And sometimes you're able to sew it back together, but other times you actually have to tear the part that is ripped out so that way it is clean, so that way you can mend it and it lasts longer. There's a time to sow and a time to tear. It's a reminder that things don't last and people grow up. There's a time to speak up and a time to be quiet. And I want you to know, often being quiet is far more valuable and far more important than saying anything. Silence is a powerful, powerful thing. Don't do away with it. We can fill our lives with a lot of noise. Be okay with some quiet. In verse 8, the teacher tells us something we kind of don't like. At least I don't. When I read it, I go, I don't know if I agree with that at first. And the birds sure disagreed with it because they just did away with the whole war bit entirely. They said, yeah, we're not even putting that in there. Keep that one out. And he begins with notions we like. He says there's times to love and there's times to seek peace. And we like these. We can understand, yes, as Christians, we are called to show love, to be peacemakers. And that is intuitive to us as we follow Christ. Much of the bulk of our time as Christians is often wrapped up in how we will show love and how we will create peace between people and ourselves. But then we ask, why in the world would the teacher in Ecclesiastes tell me that there's a time for war and a time for hate? War is awful. It's terrible. I don't know any person who has seen or witnessed or been around the after effects or been in war themselves who looks back and says, that was really good. I don't know anyone that looks at it that way. And I thought I wasn't supposed to hate. When we read God's word, something becomes clear. There are things worth fighting for. There are things worth going to war about. And there are things worth hating in this life. Our job, our task, as we continue our lives under the sun, is to discern that we fight against and hate the correct things, the things that God hates. In all these, the teacher contemplates time. You can almost feel like he's stuck inside of it. I think that's why so much of modern sci-fi is trying to get either back in time or forward in time or get outside of time in some way, is because people feel stuck by time. We are all bound by it. It marches forward at 60 seconds a minute for all of us. And in life under the sun, one day the day of peace will end, and it will be time to fight. So too the day of mourning will give way to dancing. Time moves on. And so in a system of life under the sun, we might hear that and we too feel stuck. Well, I really like the good times. I don't want the, don't let it end. Don't let the good times end. Ecclesiastes reminds us that they will. And so the teacher goes on in contemplating this, and he arrives at a couple of conclusions about who we are and who God is. In verse 9, he says, "What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live, and also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is, already has been. That which is to be, already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away." As the teacher reflects on time and eternity and the nature of God and the nature of man, it is one of the very few times in the book of Ecclesiastes that he does this. And he's reading and he says that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is, and normally the teacher says, this is hevel. It is a vapor. It is meaningless. Except, this is one of the few times he doesn't. He breaks his pattern and he says, this is God's gift to man. He does not pronounce it hevel. In chapter 2, clear back in August on the farm, we talked about the teacher's reflections on work. And in that, he concluded that often we can work our whole lives and we can build something very great, and at the end of it, we die, and somebody moves in and they don't care about it, and it's often left in disrepute. It's hevel. It's frustrating. And so at the end of that, he got to this point where he says, okay, so what do we do? And he says, well, we can eat and drink and take pleasure in our toil. We can enjoy our work. And in the flow of Ecclesiastes, the teacher discusses work, and he says we can eat and drink and take pleasure in the things we do, even though we know they won't last. And then he pauses, and he comes over here and he talks about time, and there's a time for everything. And then he moves back over here to talk about work in light of these seasons and times. And he introduces this again with a question that he asked at the end of chapter 2. And he says, what gain has the worker from all of his toil? What do we have to gain from all this? And then he says, God has given us something to be busy with. And you hear that and you go, I don't know if I want to be busy with anything. Why would God give me something to do? And the answer is because in the Bible, when God talks about work, it is talked about as if it's a good thing. God has given us a task. He's given us work. The teacher, for the first time, goes outside his thought experiment. He has been doing experiments of life under the sun, and now he's going to go outside of it. He's going to say, well, what about life not under the sun? Let's think about it for a minute. And he concludes, 1, God makes everything beautiful in its time. Everything. We have an eternal God who is good and just and loving, and who, in a way I may never fully understand, makes all things beautiful in their time. Everything. And if you are living in times of new birth, and planting, and healing, and building, and laughing, and dancing, and embracing, and keeping, and mending, and loving, and times of making peace, you can hear that God makes everything beautiful in its time, and you think, yeah, I can feel that. Everything is beautiful around me because all the stuff is good, and I'm in the middle of the good old days. But if you're in the midst of the times of dying, plucking up and killing and breaking and mourning and casting things away and losing and tearing and spreading yourself too thin and hating the right things in the times filled with war, it can be very, very difficult to hear, let alone believe, that God makes those things beautiful. It's tough. God makes everything beautiful in its time. And as the teacher reflects on this, he notes the contrast because he wants us to see that our God is not a God who just hops over here on the feel-good happy train and says, I want you all to spend the time here and I want to hang out with you over here. God is a God who also approaches us when we are over here in the awful times. In fact, I would argue this is where God often reaches us the most. The days that are not so good. God makes everything beautiful in its time. And so we're left with this feeling of, okay, well, how will God do that? I would like to know. And also, what is the task? You said God has given me a task. I'd like to know more about that. And if you're like me and you read this, you go, what type of teacher is this? I have more questions than when I started. And that's the point. That's why he's called the teacher. Most good teachers raise more questions than they answer. He wants us to think longer, struggle further. And the next conclusion he arrives at is number 2, God has set eternity in our hearts. But we are finite humans. We are never fully going to comprehend God's ways. I've said to the young adults in the past, it's something that kind of drives me bonkers. And it's this idea that when we are faced with a difficult passage of Scripture or a hard spiritual truth or a challenging theological idea, we get to that point and we go, well, I'll ask God one day when I get there. And I understand where that comes from. There are some things that we can try and try and try, and we may never know. But we cannot let that saying, I'll ask God when I get there, keep us from asking and trying to understand and seeking after God. We cannot let it. I think, as the teacher goes on to say, that even though God is beyond us, He's put eternity within us. He's put something within us that wants to know God more, that wants to figure out the things of God, even though we may never fully do so. Don't ever quit pushing forward into that. Don't ever quit trying to understand that. It longs for eternity. It longs for God. And what's even more baffling is you have this God who is eternal. He's given us this life under the sun. And he looks at us and he says, I'm going to put a little bit of life above the sun within them. I want them, once they hit those good old days, I want that to carry over into life above the sun, eternity. God puts eternity in our hearts. He wants us to not be limited by our time under the sun. But what is my task? What's the job? God gave me a job. What is it? And he arrives in verse 12 and 13. He says, be joyful, do good, and enjoy life. In this life under the sun, in light of eternity, that's what you have. Be joyful, do good, and enjoy life. And I would argue you do so in light of eternity, knowing that though you face the bad times just as the good, the God who put eternity in your heart has a way of making everything beautiful in its time and wants to one day make your eternity beautiful too. That is a God worth following. That is a God worth praising. God does the eternal things. The teacher says, what God has done, you can't undo it. God seeks what has been driven away. That's the gospel. That's it. God sought us. God in Christ takes a dirty, rotten, no good, wicked, debased, war-seeking, slanderous, foul-mouthed, wretched, unhappy, unsatisfied, discontent sinner. He makes their life and their eternity beautiful in its time. That's the gospel. That's what Jesus does. And what's fascinating is the teacher in Ecclesiastes, he didn't have Jesus' names on his lips. He knew God was going to do something. He understood that God gave him eternity. But he didn't understand how God's going to get him there. We are on this side of Jesus. Forever is a long time. Wednesday night, I asked the 3rd through 6th graders, we were reading a passage that had to do with the last day. And I said, well, hey, what is the last day? And their answers were very good. More insightful than I think often my answers could have been. One student said, well, it's the day we die. That's the last day. And I said, okay. And the other student understood that it's Jesus talking, and so it's Jesus' last day when he dies. I said, okay. And then one boy, he said, it's when the world ends. And we struggle to think of forever. It doesn't make sense to us because we get this little window into forever called our life. This life under the sun. We get a picture into forever. And what God does as an eternal God is he takes that picture and he gives us the gospel in the hopes that we can see God and then move that picture of forever into actual forever with God. That is why God has put eternity in our hearts. That is why Jesus died. Jesus died to seek and save the lost, that they too might have life above the sun, life after this life. And I want to leave you with a note that I kind of already said, but it's important. The teacher does not proclaim this hevel. He has no problem looking at something that seems good and saying, yep, that's meaningless. Even if you think about it real hard, it's going to end up being meaningless. He does not do that here. He pronounces it God's gift. No hevel anywhere found. Because it's not. It is full of meaning. It is the point of God's plan in our lives, is to get us into that eternal relationship with him. That is the point. It's this act of seeking us out and saving us that is, we understand, fulfilled in Jesus, and it is that we celebrate and we remember when we take communion. Jesus' work, the way he loved people, especially the people that lots of others would have looked at and said, yeah, you're not in the beautiful times. The way he lived and the way he died on the cross on our behalf, that we might have our lives and our eternity made beautiful too.